Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture. And this time around we're going to do something that's a slight departure from what we've been doing so far in the course. Not by a ton, but we're going to be organizing today's lecture that has primarily to do with 19th century painting around a thematic. And our thematic for today is primarily gender in art, and even more specifically, representations of woman and femininity in the 19th century. Now, you might want to think about this the same way we were thinking about portraits early on, in that I said, and I want us to be thinking about this the whole time through, works of art are representations that are shot through or in one way or another influenced by the beliefs of the people of the time that were both producing these works of art and consuming these works of art. And so you can always see these kinds of ideological positions on particular issues. And one of the easiest ones to recognize is the different roles that are played by each gender. It's one of the reasons that I gave you the readings for this week that are written by two very important contemporaries. One is Catherine Beecher, who is the sister of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and the other is Margaret Fuller, both very prominent figures in their own rights, but coming at the question of what women's role should be from quite different stances. So, in works of art, what we tend to see, of course, are repetitions of stereotypical ideas about what a woman should be. It's not, as we've said a couple of times in this class, necessarily what all women were, but they are, as art almost always is, projections of what one expects or what one hopes, or a kind of aspirational image of what woman should be. So we're going to be spending some time on that. But I don't want to spend the entire time on that. I want to weave in a couple of other ideas in this lecture. One of them is we're going to be looking at two very prominent women artists. And we've seen a couple here and there before, but honestly, the women that we looked at up to this point, just a couple of them, didn't have a huge influence on art and weren't particularly all that, let's say, popular at the time. However, the two that we're going to be looking at today, Lily Martin Spencer and Mary Cassatt, were major figures in the art world at the time. And this will give me a chance to talk about some of the difficulties that faced women artists in the 19th century, and frankly, even till today. The final thing that I want to talk about is the rise of modernist ideas. And I'll do this near the end of the lecture when we start talking about James McNeill Whistler and Mary Cassatt. And again, modernism is we'll talk about it when we get there, but think of it as not simply artists who are interested in abstraction in art. That's a big part of it. But modernism is actually an historical period with its own kind of assumptions about the world and its own tendencies, and it influences all levels of culture and frankly the wider world. And so we're going to start talking about what some of those ideas are and how they start showing up in art. Okay, so then on with the game here. We've already seen this work, maybe not this close up, but I wanted to refresh our memory about one thing that we've been talking about in terms of gender in art. This is John Vanderlyn's Ariadne Asleep on the Island of Naxos. To remind you, it's a close-up of her face. It is a work that, as I said before, was very popular. It won an award when it was shown in the Salon in the Royal Exhibition of the Arts in Paris at the time. And yet, when he brought it back to the United States, as I hope you'll recall, it wasn't met with the same degree of enthusiasm. And the big reason was that, of course, in the United States, we didn't yet have a really solid understanding or tradition or interest in the long-standing tradition of the female nude, a particular genre, right, a particular kind of classification of art that had been around at least since ancient Greek times and had its own kind of justification in Europe that Americans didn't know about. And so when they were greeted with this, they thought, wow, this is just incredibly sexual, and this is, part of those bankrupt values that Europeans have. We're a very God-fearing, basically Protestant/Puritan-based culture, and we're not going to have anything of this. At least early on. That's going to change over the course of the 19th century. But let me remind you what the philosophy was behind this, because again, this shows up over and over again in art. It's worth knowing so that you understand why it was okay for all of these really Christian cultures, many of whom have deep, let's say, skepticism about eroticism, particularly in the public realm when it's like high art. You can't show it there. You can do it maybe privately in your home, but you shouldn't have it in your art. So you have to kind of give a cover story to these types of representations. When it comes to classical aesthetics, remember what I said. When people were representing female nudity, they justified it by saying, what I'm really representing is beauty, with a capital B, universal timeless beauty. Remember, going back to the classical tradition, all the way back to Plato, beauty also came with the idea that things were truthful and things were morally correct, that Platonic triangle that we talked about. So that if you represented perfect beauty, whether it be male beauty, which again was the privileged form of nudity, or female beauty, somehow that was a kind of embodiment of truth and moral goodness as well. Now, this is one of the ways to cover up the fact that it's also something else, a very erotic representation of a nude woman lying there for your visual pleasure. And that's where I have to bring in another idea. By the mid-century, and while they didn't coin this term, it's going to be coined by the, let's say, the beginning of the 20th century, a little bit before that. They're talking about this idea that we know today as something called sublimation. Now, sublimation is a term borrowed from psychoanalytic theory by the arts to try to, again, tease out what's going on when you have an image that is erotic on the one hand, or has some vestiges of something that's erotic or lowbrow, or what they would have called at the time vulgar, but yet is supposed to be high art. And so the idea of sublimation, again, not to be mistaken for the sublime, they're not the same thing at all, is that maybe at some level, nudity, let's say nudity in everyday life, is vulgar, meaning base, meaning kind of lowbrow, meaning just an emotion, just something that is, charged with desire and so forth. Maybe at the everyday level that's around, and maybe when the artist, for instance, had a model sit for him so that he could start, creating this form, there was something of an erotic element to that artist looking at that woman. What happens, so this theory goes, is that in the process of making a painting and idealizing it, that original kind of, again, full of desire, full of emotion, full of eroticism charge gets rechanneled and turned into high art. A really kind of common trope for this in contemporary movies, which I see all the time, the same kind of idea, maybe you've seen it before as well, is that, again, the narrative usually goes something like this. It's oftentimes an author rather than an artist. He's an older man. He hasn't written forever because he's got writer's block, or he's drinking too much, or whatever's going on. But then he meets a much younger, usually beautiful student. It's almost always a student, by the way, who he is absolutely clearly attracted to. And yet, because of the age difference and because that's not appropriate, no sexual interaction occurs, but he takes that erotic charge that he has to this new kind of influence in his life, and he rechannels it towards the creation of great literature, right? He starts writing again. That's the basic idea of sublimation. Something starts lowbrow, vulgar, a base emotion like desire, but gets rechanneled into the creation of high art. Now, I think it's, just basically a cover story. I don't think that's something that you necessarily need to believe is absolutely true, but it is one of the other ways that you justified something when someone said, wait, isn't that erotic? It's a nude woman lying on a bed there giving me a come hither look, or, inviting me to admire her. Isn't there something erotic there? And people would say, no, 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 it's not just base eroticism. That eroticism has been turned into something more noble, something that is high art, something that is an ideal that comes with beauty, truth, and goodness, and so forth. So that's one side of things. In the 20th century, and again, these types of discussions actually started much earlier on, but let's say within the last 40 or 50 years, they have really gotten going. A lot of historians, particularly art historians, have looked back at this long tradition of the nude and said, well, instead of taking these cover stories or these justifications for nudity at face value and trying to situate ourselves in the period I of the time and say, what did they say they were trying to do? Isn't there something else that might be going on here? And they have gone at these the way that I talked about it before, which is to be a little bit critical of what you're looking at, not in terms of saying, whoa, isn't this a bad artist, but to say, what are the types of operations of power that are going on in these types of images? How do they set up in what we call a viewing dynamic? The kind of role that you are presumed to be playing as a viewer. How do they set up these power relationships? And how is gender involved in that? And as I said last time, the way that this works is pretty simple, isn't it? I mean, the presumption is when you're looking at an image like this, that you are a heterosexual male viewer. And as such, you are put into a position of visual mastery. Now, I've called this viewing dynamic voyeuristic because you're the one who gets to see, while oftentimes her eyes are closed or she's sleeping, or even when she returns your gaze, it's a very compliant, very submissive type of look that she gives you, a kind of come hither look. And this puts all the power in your hands. So in the voyeuristic viewing dynamic, you, and again, you don't need to be a heterosexual male, but that's the one that is presumed, you're put into a position of visual mastery, of power. All of the desires that you have can be projected onto this figure who is, after all, a bit of an object for you. She doesn't look back. She doesn't have any kind of indications of what her feelings or desires might be if she had any on her own, right? She's literally just a body there for you to project your desires onto. And of course, the entire picture is set up that way. If you've ever wondered why these women are lying in these suggestive poses with, again, they're impossible. Both men and women should try to affect this posture just sometime. Lie on your bed and try to get both of your shoulders back on the ground, and then twist your torso enough so that you can get one breast in perfect profile and the other one straight on, and then roll your hips up to emphasize the swell of the hips, which at this time we're seeing as very erotic. All of that is basically posed with you as the viewer in mind to make that body look even more desirable, to give you the perfect kind of pleasure in looking at that body. It's the same thing that happens all the time to supermodels, right? If you've ever seen the backstage scenes of, let's say, Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue or something like that, where these women are doing these incredibly contorted poses in order to make their bodies look good for the camera, that's the kind of contorted pose that is being affected here too. And again, my point in saying this is to say that it's not real. It's not about her feelings. It's about her fashioning herself, or rather an artist fashioning a female body in order to be pleasurable to a presumptively heterosexual male viewer. Now let's make this a little bit more complicated. Let's say you're a heterosexual woman viewer. What goes on for you when you look at these images? Over the last, again, 30, 40, 50 years or so, what women initially started arguing here, which is, I think, quite compelling, is that what happens is you identify in terms of your gender. So if you're a heterosexual woman, you in essence want to be like her, right? You want to be desirable like she is. We all try to fashion ourselves, after all, according to what the prevailing views are in our society, what our society values about each of our genders. This is a big part of our way of thinking about ourselves. And in these cases, the argument goes that women will want to be like her because they see that if they're more like her, they get rewarded with attention, they get rewarded with, someone finding them desirable, being deemed to be attractive, and so forth. This argument's really compelling, especially when you think about what is on the cover of a lot of magazines that are, again, pitched towards women, Cosmo, Elle, whatever it is. And on the cover of those magazines, you have these incredibly beautiful women, oftentimes very provocatively posed. And, of course, these are being sold to women, many of whom I would presume are heterosexual women. Why are they buying this? Because those images are things that they want to be like. Maybe not consciously, but certainly at some kind of subconscious level. Now, the whole thing gets incredibly complicated if we stop being heteronormative and we start thinking in, let's say, homosexual terms or homoerotic terms. But you can imagine how this still sets up that kind of dynamic of a person in power and a person without power. Now, to take it one step further, why are they always passive? Why are they always with their eyes closed? Why are they always just inviting our gaze but not showing any of their desire of their own? These, believe it or not, were ideas that were very broadly held about women and their kind of sexuality at large. It was absolutely firmly believed, and I still hear this all the time today, that women's nature was basically passive, right? That women were supposed to be submissive to the stronger sex, the male sex. And that when it came to issues around sexuality, and believe me, this is, let's say, an ideal rather than the way people probably saw women acting or behaving or knew that they were actually in private. People really argued over and again that women's sexual nature was basically one that was passive, maybe even not existent on its own, and that it had to be activated by the much more kind of aggressive male sexuality, and then only, again, this is when it's only good in terms of producing children. In other words, they would say things like, well, women don't really have any sexual urges. They respond to or are activated by male sexual urges. And so you see these things kind of showing up in these paintings that are meant to be representations of the ideal. Ideal in terms of something that's very highly esteemed about women in the first place, their looks, right? Their attractiveness. Second thing is, well, how do you then picture that attractiveness according to these other expectations about women's behavior? Passive, compliant, frankly non-sexual, except in response to male sexuality. And you can keep going on with that kind of ad infinitum. There's a ton of literature on this subject. We also saw this, so I just want to kind of remind us that we have seen some representations that, along with the other things that they do, all the other representing that they're doing, have been about gender. This is the other work by John Vanderlyn, the one that was actually accepted in or found very popular in the reception in the United States. This is The Death or the Murder of Jane McCrae. And what did we say about gender here? Again, this is an artist who is very influenced by classical aesthetics. So he's always wanting to represent the ideal. And frankly, again, I want to say this over and again, representations in art are more often than not about the ideal, trying to picture something according to what the expectations are, in this case in terms of gender. So here, what did I say about gender? Well, again, we've got an indication here that women are weaker, right? She is a victim after all. And over and again, you represent women as victims so that you don't have to show men as being victims, which would run counter to the idea that men are the stronger sex. Then you indicate some kind of sexual victimization as well here. Women are sexualized over and again by showing her nipple. Again, not a wardrobe malfunction done on purpose here. Then you show her, again, gentle, caring, nurturing. She doesn't fight back because women are not violent. That was, again, an ideal. I am absolutely sure that people from time to time realize that a woman who otherwise is, a model of what the expectations are in society, if pressed, if attacked like this, would fight back. But I want to remind us that works of art are meant to represent the perfect ideal response, in this case, to the situation, and she acts appropriately by, instead of biting, clawing, fighting back, looking up for deliverance to God. Remember, these are all representations of this classical tradition. So here in Power is the Greek slave that we've already gone over. No reason to go over this again, except to say, how do you apply these ideas here? Well, again, victim, passive, compliant, not fighting back, about the beauty of that body. And what did I say about this one? I gave us a different term to entertain, the idea of the double articulation, saying two things that on the surface might seem completely contradictory, but they both work together. So on the surface, remember, the Greek slave is supposedly a condemnation of the way that the Turks were treating the Greeks that they were taking as prisoners in their exit from the Turkish-Greek wars that were about the Greek wars of liberation against the Turks. And, of course, it came along with its own pamphlet that explained this. But it sells 12 large-scale copies, over 200 small-scale copies, and it doesn't take much to imagine that people are buying this because that story, that original, no, that's the first articulation, this is bad, we should condemn this, authorizes or allows a kind of hidden pleasure of the very thing that it's condemning. People are buying this, in other words, because it gives justification for looking at this beautiful female body that otherwise they couldn't have looked at. And one can even go further than this and say that at some level, making her passive, compliant on her way to being a sex slave is also in the minds of people that are buying this and justified. And I'm not saying that they were all perfectly aware of this, but again, it's one of those types of dynamics that authorizes a certain representation of female nudity, in this case in the United States, although it's not exclusive to the United States at all. Just brought in one of these because, again, in the United States, we don't have that long tradition of the female nude as a genre. And again, when someone like Vanderlyn tries to show it, the American public is, I think, rightly so, a little bit like, wait a minute, isn't this erotic? And don't we have some kind of societal rules against this type of stuff? And again, even more so than Europe, there's almost allergic response to eroticism in the United States. So how do you sneak it in one way or another? And one way is through the classical tradition, which again we saw Americans don't really like that much. So another way is through the double articulation, in which you say, hey, this is horrible, don't do this, but then you basically say, look at this that you're not supposed to do. And then another way is something like this, this is Rembrandt Peale. It's one of the sons of Charles Wilson Peale. I told you that he named all of his kids, or that's not true. I think he only named his boys after artists, but he had Rembrandt and Raphael Peale. And this is Rembrandt Peale's work called After the Bath. It's a trompe l'oeil painting, right? This is those hyper-illusionistic paintings that you're supposed to imagine that you're really looking at a woman basically behind this, I don't know what it's supposed to be, a sheet or something like that. And you can kind of imagine that the woman doesn't have any clothes on. And certainly you can imagine this if you knew the original, that I presume many people did. But it's just got that kind of minor erotic charge to it. And this is all that was really entirely, acceptable in the United States at this time. The artist is basically doing another double articulation in which he's using his skill at tricking you into believing you're looking at a real sheet covering up a nude body, right? That's the justification. But of course, it has still got this erotic charge of trying to imagine what is behind that sheet, which he has actually copied another artist's work, by the way. That's what you would have seen behind the sheet if it fell down. So I'm jumping way forward in time, but the reason to do this, and I'll bring this guy back very briefly in a later lecture, is to say that when we started developing these new institutions to art that I began talking about last time, the Philadelphia Academy to the Arts, or the Pennsylvania Academy to the Arts, and the New York Academy of Design, and there are other minor institutions as well, the classical tradition over the course of the 19th century, and especially in the last 20 years of the 19th century, starts to become more and more acceptable. And one of the reasons for that, if you're wondering, is I believe it's really common that when you have fledgling institutions, new schools to the art, they're constantly seeking some kind of tradition to base their practice on. And the largest, most kind of time-honored tradition that they could seek out is the classical tradition. And as we got less worried about, let's say, our needing to distance ourselves from Europe, the classical tradition starts to get more acceptable. So this artist's name is Kenyon Cox, and I don't need to talk about this at any great length. The title of the work is called An Eclogue. An eclogue is a kind of poem. It's a dialogic poem that has a call and a return. And there's something of that in here, but I'll go into that in a minute. It's primarily a reason for the artist to show you the female nude in multiple different poses, right? Now, let's talk about this again. One of the things that's going on here, especially if you look at this one, the red-haired one up here with her clothes on, is that she's wearing an artist's smock, right? This is, generally speaking, if you've ever taken a life drawing class, you'll know that the nude model will come into class usually wearing some clothes, disrobe clothes, pose herself, and then we go to work trying to represent her. So in this case, she's still got hers on. This figure only partially on, this figure none at all, and this figure none at all either. So an eclogue, as I said, is a poem, is dialogic. You've got someone who says one verse and someone who returns that verse. In this, the dialogue is happening between the female models and the artist. And the models show their beauty, and the artist returns that beauty to the canvas through ennobling it, making it more ideal. It's, in other words, the process of sublimation at work. If you've ever wondered why women are holding apples in these things all of the time, the reason is that the apple is a symbol of the goddess Venus, or the goddess, as she was known first in Greek times, Aphrodite, who was awarded a golden apple from the Garden of the Hesperides for being the most beautiful of all of the goddesses. That is, by the way, the starting point of the Trojan War, but that's another story. And what is the artist trying to do here? He's trying to show you female beauty from three different poses: a frontal, scene of the back, and a reclining scene here. And again, it's all justified by the classical tradition. I want to emphasize this: of the ways that women have been esteemed through history and thus represented accordingly, one of the standard big ones is for their physical beauty, for their allure, right? That's a big one. Another big one is for being mothers, their maternity, their ability to give life. Then one of the other things I said that you should keep your eye on is that women, again, because of their bodies oftentimes corresponding to the natural processes or cycles of nature, going through their own menstrual cycles is a kind of graphic way to put it, but also because their bodies can give birth and are like Mother Nature, are oftentimes juxtaposed with nature. And look at this one, right? You've got a tree in the background full of apples. They're holding apples. They're lying on the grass here. I mean, there's no rational explanation for what the hell's going on here, is there? I mean, you couldn't say, well, there were four women, they were out in nature, and, it got really hot, so they decided to take off all their clothes. And no, I mean, it just makes zero sense whatsoever. It's all just an excuse to show female beauty and to juxtapose it against the thing that women are seen to be, nature, like nature's processes. So I'm going to pause here. I'll be right back. Sorry for the little blip. So now I want to talk about something that is a much more complex set of historical issues than I'm going to be able to deal with here today, but at least it'll get you thinking about this. And that's, why haven't there been so many women artists in this class? And historically, why are there fewer women artists than there are male artists? Now, there's a famous article that was written in I think it was the early 70s by Linda Nochlin called Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, where she kind of takes you through all the steps for why this avenue of artistic creation wasn't particularly open to women. And I'll rehearse a couple of those ideas here. But I want to start by talking about, in the United States at this point, how it would have been so difficult for a woman artist to become an artist. And we've only seen, again, one or two little blips here. One of the reasons is, let's just take, for instance, the major art form in the United States in the 19th century, landscape painting, and talk about, let's say you're a woman and you want to be a great landscape painter. Now, it might be okay for you to paint your backyard, and let's say it might even be okay, although it's stretching it, to go out and paint, for instance, the Hudson River Valley and so forth. But now you're doing things that are what men do primarily, which is women are correspondent with nature, but they're not supposed to be out there working in nature, right? It's harder work. They have to lug along all their painting supplies. They're going to have to grind these painting supplies. They're basically doing manual labor out in nature, and that's the guy's job to do, right? And as the century goes forward and landscape painting suddenly necessitates that you're traveling out west, that you're actually going on caravans and you're going along with surveying crews and so forth, the idea that a proper woman would do that is something that most people didn't believe. Now, back to this other thing. Okay, let's say classical arts are acceptable in the United States and you want to be a classical artist. And this is where Linda Naughlin's famous article comes in. As Nochlin pointed out, let's say you want to be a classically trained artist. You go off to Paris to train. Who are you taking with you? It's not okay for women to travel alone, so you've got to have chaperones with you. Historically speaking, if you are going to apprentice to an artist studio, it's not necessarily a particularly safe place to be. There's many instances where women artists have been documented as being sexually assaulted in artist studios. Most famous is Artemisia Gentileschi. But the bigger one is, let's say you finally get there and you want to train. It's absolutely necessary that you understand human anatomy. There's just so many places that representing either a nude or a perfectly proportioned form necessitates you understand anatomy inside and out. And the sciences, such as going to dissection lessons or studying, let's say, nude figures, actual live figures, those are two avenues that women really aren't allowed into. And it's very infrequent that women get that kind of training. So the classical tradition's a pretty tough one as well. So what changes in the 19th century, frankly, to allow more women to start becoming artists is not a change in the idea of what women are necessarily or what their roles should be, but rather an opening up to different types of genres in painting that are being purchased by the public, because the public now is starting to show what we would call today a burgeoning middle class. You start to get more people that have some money. They're not the incredibly wealthy elites, but they have enough money that they can buy things that are basically luxury objects, such as paintings. And that then opens up a market for new genres of painting that they can buy, such as what you see here. This is actually a portrait of Mrs. Fithian called We Both Must Fade by Lily Martin Spencer. Now, it's a portrait, but it's also one that she worked up a couple of more times and sold to the public as a beautiful representation of kind of the ideal woman of the time. So, and we'll see a couple of different genres by Lily Martin Spencer that are basically genre scenes. They're scenes of everyday life or scenes that are narratives about kind of upper middle class couples and their lives that become, let's say, an acceptable art form in the United States, one that is profitable, one that people can sell, but maybe not like at the highest level. Someone like Lily Martin Spencer is seen more as a popular artist than, let's say, someone like Albert Bierstadt, who's doing the real, highbrow art of landscape painting, or any of these classical artists that we've shown so far. So then, again, women artists, pretty difficult position to be in. Lily Martin Spencer was trained. She was a child of a, believe it or not, socialist, so she was a little bit more, let's say, liberal than most of the American public was at the time. She supported women's rights. She wanted to actually start a utopian society, her own kind of commune. She found a lot of support among those who supported temperance, right, the outlaw of drinking, and the abolitionists. She's primarily self-taught, although she clearly took some classes. She was the major breadwinner for her family through her art. Her husband made nowhere near as much money as she made it in her art. And she was still, how do I put this, a pretty productive mother. She had 13 children. Unfortunately, only 7 of them survived until adulthood, but she was burning the candle at both ends, so to speak. So in her art, what you tend to see are representations of femininity that reflect the values of the age. So in this work, We Both Shall Fade, basically what the narrative is that this beauty, just like the flower in her hand, is going to fade. It's what we call in art a vanitas picture. It's a representation of female beauty with all of the finery of this clothing. She has in her hands and on the table symbols of material wealth, right? All of this jewelry here in the boxes. She holds in her hand a flower. It's been picked, though, and the title then refers to the idea that beauty, like life, fades. And vanitas pictures are basically moralizing lessons that are, in this case, double articulations again, in which, in this case, what it's saying is, in a vanitas picture, usually you put a woman's face in front of a mirror, which is going on here, right? It looks like an open window, but there's a mirror over here. Basically says, don't get too caught up in your material wealth or your beauty, because after all, you're going to age, you're going to die, and what you really have to do is keep your eye on heaven, the afterlife. That's your basic vanitas, right? Most times in the European tradition, she'll be holding a mirror right up in front of her hand. In this case, the flower and the mirror off into this space over here are presumed in order to say, again, don't get too caught up in your looks, your material wealth. Think about your afterlife. It's a way to get in a Christian story along with a show of all of this wealth that we know goes way back to the first lecture and reveals that God's favor is with you as long as you don't get too opulent with your display of wealth. But it is a double articulation, too. It's saying, don't get too caught up in your beauty, and then the entire picture is really about her beauty and her wealth. And this is how Lily Martin Spencer really made a boatload of money. She represented scenes of femininity that jibed perfectly with expectations of the time and even a little flirtation. This is probably her most famous work. It's called Kiss Me and You'll Kiss the Lasses. Now, the title here refers to the molasses she's just tipped her spoon in. That's super sweet, but by truncating this and saying lasses, she's really talking about women, right? If you kiss me or you kiss women, you'll taste the molasses that I've just tasted. So it's meant to be kind of moderately flirtatious without going too much overboard. And then the other thing it does, of course, is represent women in a very particular way, according to a kind of ideal of what the perfect woman is, so to speak. She's in a domestic interior, she's making food, she's playing one of her fundamental roles, which is the nurturing figure, the nurturing perhaps housewife, or the potentially nurturing housewife, the cook. So again, surrounded by things that involve what she is esteemed for. Beauty or sexual availability to some degree, right? Kiss me. The other part is nurturing, taking care of the household, feeding the family, producing children eventually, and so forth. Over and over again, that's kind of her MO, Spencer's MO, is to create these pictures of flirtatious women. This is the Jolly Washerwoman from, again, the middle of the century, 1850 in this case, 1851. In which you've got, again, I know by our standards today, this woman may not be everyone's kind of provocatively beautiful woman, but she's, for the day, very cute. She's doing some washing, and basically she's paused in the washing to look at us and give us a big flirtatious smile. Remember, open mouth, kind of showing a lot of teeth, smiles are incredibly flirtatious. And so, you've got this kind of lower class woman. The presumption is that, she's, who knows what her home life is, but I don't see, rings on those fingers, who is doing some work and has paused to give us a kind of little flirtatious glance. What is she doing? She's cleaning, right? She is taking care of the house. That is a woman's role at this time, and it's something that, again, will be represented over and over again in these genre paintings. This one is called Shake Hands from 1854. It's about, again, a woman making, some baking, and you've just come up to kind of say hi to her, and she reaches out to shake your hand, but she can't because it's covered with flour. And once again, she gives us that kind of flirtatious smile. You can probably see the way that this works, and if you're wondering about the surface here, you're actually looking at her through a window, and so there are all these reflections on the other side of the space in order to give us a sense of Lily Martin Spencer's skills. You can see an exit sign over here and so forth. And then scenes of kind of domestic bliss. This is a work that's called Domestic Happiness from around the same time, middle of the century, in which you've got the young couple and, the children here. This is the typical nuclear family of the time. The woman's represented as beautiful. They even kind of have the dress or whatever it is, nightgown, coming down off of her shoulder to show you some of that. She is closer to the children, right? She's closer to them, kind of leaning in on them the way that the man is not, even though he's there. It shows what her primary role is going to be the provider of children and to nurture those children, and also, frankly, to take care of the house and to nurture the husband. She also, I think, some of the things that are easily lost when you look at historical pictures is the humor. I mean, there's definitely some plays on humor in all the works that we've seen so far. They're kind of flirtatious. The women are a little bit frumpy, but cute enough. That would have been a playful little jibe towards the female nudes that are everywhere to be found by this point. And then this one is the young husband's first marketing, where you've got the husband who's gone off to market He's new at this. His wife sent him out. Generally speaking, this is the woman's job, but she's got other things to do at this point, one presumes. So he's been sent to do it, and he's not very good at it, right? He's trying to get this stuff home, but he's dropping things right and left. Finally, putting these things all together in a way, this is a work that is called Peeling the Onions. And, you've got, once again, the woman taking care of the presumptive family. She's cooking. She's surrounded by things that are symbolic of both cooking, but also the idea of woman as procreator. Fruit, historically, is symbolic of women's ability to bear children. Or to be sexually available. So you see all the peaches and apples on the table, some berries and grapes as well. And then, of course, we want to add into this equation. So she's making food. There's little symbols that she is, can bear children. And then you also want to get in this little emotional element to it. So she's cutting the onions that are causing her to tear up. And it gives you this kind of sympathetic view of the woman who is emotional versus the standard representation of men will be rational. And we've seen this especially in the classical tradition. So one other thing to add to this, women are emotional, men are rational. Again, I'm not saying this stuff's true. I'm just saying those are the ways that people have thought about gender historically that show up in the art of various periods. Now I want to move on to a couple of artists, three artists at the end of this, who are American-born, but frankly they spent the vast majority of their careers outside of the United States. This is James McNeill Whistler. He spent the vast majority of his time in England and showed as well as at the famous French Salon of the French Royal Academy. But he's a fantastic artist, and because he is American-born, we're going to include him in this class. And I want to talk, before we even get started on these artists, about the rise of modernist ideas and modernism in Europe, especially at the time, and it will influence slowly but surely and a little bit later in arriving the United States as well. Now, a lot of people who think about modern art are immediately going to be thinking about abstraction, and that's certainly a big part of modern art. But I want to start us off with a different idea. I want to start us off by thinking that modernism is an historical period, right? It's not just a style of art. And one of the hallmarks of modernism is that modernism tends to think about history in terms of a constant kind of series of changes. And so unlike, let's say, classical artists or classically inspired views of history in which you think that you're returning to golden ages. In other words, there was this moment in time of Greece and it was wonderful, and then things go wrong and you drop down, Alexander the Great goes too far and Greece goes down into a little bit of chaos, but out of the ashes of that comes Rome, and it looks back to Greece and revitalizes all those traditions. Then Rome collapses. Then you have the Renaissance, does the same thing, and that kind of view of history. Modernism basically thinks of history as constantly changing, and thus every moment of time people need to determine what aspects and traditions and conventions of the past are appropriate to the present. Right? So let's say you're an artist from the mid-century and in mid-19th century in Europe forward, you're going to be more and more influenced by this idea, and you're not going to look to classical precedents. You're going to say, right now, what's going on in the world? How do we think about things? What's new? What's exciting? And then also think, what were artists doing before now that are still relevant today? I'll only bring those things into my art, and the things that aren't relevant to today, I'm going to leave those back in the past. Within the realm of art, then, one of the ways that what is relevant to the present moment shows up is in contemporary subject matter. So that if you think of someone like Benjamin West and the classical artists creating works of art that predominantly are about historical themes, more and more modern artists are saying, I'm going to paint scenes of modern life, or I'm going to paint scenes that are commentaries on things that are going on in the world today. That's one big thing. Another big thing, though, and this is one that shows up in Whistler's art, and I'll keep coming back to this. So if it doesn't quite make sense to you right off the bat, I will keep coming back to this, is that artists of all types of artists, whether they be musicians, whether they be architects, whether they be painters, sculptors, poets, playwrights, and so forth, started asking a question which went something like this. What does my art form do better than any other art form? What is its essential characteristic, right? What are the qualities to my art form that make it different than every other art form? What is its basis? What is its essence? And they started asking that question because what they're basically doing is almost specializing. They're saying something, and painting is a good example of this, saying something like, well, painting's been doing all these things for many, many years that maybe are better done by theater or maybe better done by sculpture. After all, they would say something like, painting at its basis is a two-dimensional surface. So every time it tries to represent something that looks three-dimensional, it's trying to push itself outside of its area of competence, what it's really good at. And it needs to find another thing to do. Now, I'm just introducing this idea right now, and I'm going to pick it up in a moment with some of Whistler's later works, which are really being influenced by the rise of what was called art for art's sake ideas, in order to really flesh out some of the moves that were made by modern artists. And this will be a big part of this class, and it'll be a big part, or one of the major things that you'll be writing on for your second formal essay. So keep these things in mind, right? Early on, though, for Whistler, in this work called The Music Room, he's being influenced by Impressionism. Now, Impressionism is not quite around yet, but the ideas that are going to burgeon into Impressionism are starting to be floated around. This is a work from 1860. Impressionism proper really doesn't get going until the 1870s or so. But the idea of kind of greater and greater use of what's known as loose brushstroke or painterly qualities to the surface of a canvas, things that are not really meant to look hyper-illusionistic, but instead are supposed to draw attention to the fact that a painting's surface is covered with beautiful little patchworks of pigment. And that's pleasurable in and of itself, is something that was being talked about at this time. But another thing that is being used by a number of artists, in particular people like Edouard Manet, and supported by major literary figures such as Baudelaire, is the idea that an artist's job is to paint a scene from everyday life and make a little bit of a commentary on it. And that's really what I want to focus on here. Since we were talking about gender, we've got three representations of femininity in this work. Very prominent, really standing out to us, is the woman on the right, all dressed in black riding gear, holding a riding crop in her hand. She is a representation of what was derogatorily termed at the time an Amazon woman. She's an independent woman, in other words. She doesn't need a chaperone. No one's going to tell her what to do. She's breaking basic rules of 19th century society and going out on her own. And what happens to these women is that, frankly, the public is pretty mean to them, especially when they're out on their own. They will get a lot of people saying snide things to them, talking behind their backs. But they are agitating for change in a world that honestly does not allow women to go out on their own on the street because, again, they're supposed to be chaperoned by older women or men. And this is a representation of a particular type of independent woman. She's very assertive. She's very strong. Notice how Whistler puts her all the way up to the top of the frame. That makes her look even bigger. The very black, bold, use of black here, very bold, stands out to us and makes her look pretty powerful. Over on the other side, and this woman over here, if you follow my cursor, is actually a representation of a woman in a mirror, this is a mirror here, and the woman somewhere over in this realm, is another representation of femininity. This is the domestic housewife, and she is only, let's say, unassertive mirror image, a reflection of a woman. She doesn't have the same she doesn't stand out in the same way. She is fit into what society expects from her. That's her child, by the way, sitting there. She's the housewife. She's following the rules, but she's a pale reflection of a real woman. And then caught in between these two roles, so to speak, is the young girl who's reading a book, unaware that she's going to have choices to make as she gets older. She can either follow the role set by the independent woman and face the consequences of society treating her pretty shabbily, or she can follow the role of her mother and become the domestic housewife, but perhaps not be fulfilled in her life. Now, Whistler, went at the question of gender like so many of his age, because in the middle of the century, in Europe in particular, questions about what the roles of gender should be were being addressed more and more. Now remember, women aren't going to get the right to vote anywhere in Europe or in the United States until basically after World War I. And in France, where he exhibited this work, they're not going to get the right to vote until after World War II. Now I want to start first by talking about his representation of femininity here. This is a work originally called The White Girl. Later on he titled this Symphony in White. It's from 1862. For those of you who've taken art history classes before, you should be aware that this work was shown in the famous Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the Refused, where, alongside Edouard Manet's Olympia, this was the second most despised work in the show. It was not accepted primarily because the way that he represents women. Everyone knew who his model was for this. Her name was Joanna Heffernan. Joanna ended up being his lifelong partner, but she had, let's say, made the rounds of many other artists before her. She was an independent, very beautiful, very smart woman who didn't follow the rules of society, had a lot of boyfriends early on, and frankly, people knew about this, and she didn't really care about that at all. When Whistler represents her, he's representing her in a fairly common way as an object of desire, but where the public had a problem with this, or one of the reasons they had a problem with this, is she's standing on a bearskin rug, which is a symbol of passion. She's holding a flower in her hand that's drooped down. That's a symbol of the fallen woman, a woman who's had sex outside of marriage. And then if you look at her face, she does not look, and this is the big problem, she doesn't look properly ashamed of her actions. Many artists had represented women as fallen women, but they're always like crying, oh, I can't believe that I lost my virginity, and how is any man ever going to love me now? That's the way that society expected women to act when they broke the rules of their own chastity. Of course, it's a massive double standard that men weren't held to. Here, she looks, let's say, wide-eyed and thoughtful, but not properly ashamed. And the public couldn't tolerate that. And the fact that they knew that this was a woman who was basically a fallen woman by their standards and was not properly ashamed as well is something they didn't like either. So he's representing femininity and feminine desire, eroticism, a woman who has her own desires, has her own needs, has her own wants, has her own mind here, who is not fitting into the standards of the day. The other reason, though, that they disliked it, and this gets to a big idea in modernism, and Whistler is one of the first truly artists to truly embrace kind of modern ideas, is that it has to do with the way that he retitled this. I think is the best way to get at this. Later on in his career, particularly in the early 1870s, he started titling all his works and retitling earlier works after musical types of arrangements. So this one later got titled Symphony in White, and he'll call works symphonies and nocturnes and arrangements after musical compositions, because what he wanted to do is use music as a metaphor for modern art and art for art's sake. Art for art's sake simply means this. Art's entire purpose is to create a visual pleasure for you. That it might do other things, but its main point is to create a visual pleasure for you. And so the way that it does that is through an arrangement of the formal elements in such a way as to provoke in you this kind of aesthetic response to the work of art. Or another way to put this is art for art's sake is counter to just about everything that we've seen in this class so far, in that it's saying that the reason that you enjoy art has not much to do with, or shouldn't have much to do with, the ideas that it communicates. Rather, it is like music, in that music doesn't have to have a meaning. Music can just be an arrangement of sounds that provoke in us an emotional feeling where we say, wow, I really like that. And art should be allowed to do the same thing. I hope that makes sense to people. Think of, let's say, classical music. It's not really trying to necessarily communicate something to you. Some of it is. Some of it's intended to be expressionistic. But more often than not, it's supposed to be exhilarating. It's supposed to be exciting. It's supposed to create sadness. It's supposed to basically play with your emotions. And so artists began, particularly modern artists, to use this metaphor of music and say, well, why can't painting or sculpture or any art form be thought of in the same way? So when he calls it symphony in white, look at all the white tonalities that he has in the background, these different values and changes in intensity of that white. That is his arrangement of all of these form elements in a way to provoke in us an aesthetic response, to just say, wow, I really like that texture next to that texture, next to this tonality, next to that. And he would do this over and over again. This is the Little White Girl, Symphony in White number 2. Same idea, right? It's a beautiful woman. There are little nods in modern art towards the old traditions. It's like a vanitas picture where you show her frontal and then you show her in a mirror. She's surrounded by these little touches, such as the flowers here that are symbolic of fertility. But he's also saying, isn't this just a beautiful kind of arrangement of form, of textures, of brush strokes? And you get up close on these things, right? He's not trying to make them look absolutely hyper-realistic anymore, because modern artists started to become aware, and I think many of us have this same feeling, that one of the great pleasures of looking at art has to do with not being tricked into believing what you're looking at is real, but seeing the actual paint and its texture and its qualities and really feeling like, wow, that's quite visually pleasing. One of his major patrons was the Leylands. This is Mrs. Frances Leyland here. Same idea, right? Beautiful representation of all of these different tonalities next to each other. Or the artist's mother. Again, representations of femininity on the one hand, the older woman, and on the other hand, representations of modernist ideas. He actually called this, instead of the artist's mother, of course, he called this arrangement in gray and black, an arrangement being a musical arrangement, and said that it didn't have anything to do with his mother, it just had to do with one shape or one texture or one pattern juxtaposed with another to create a pleasing composition for us all. So, moving ahead now to Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt was trained originally at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Arts. She was very ambitious, so she moved to Europe at a very smart time in the 1870s, I think it was the late 60s into the early 70s, and she immediately made friends with a number of the Impressionist artists. Now, Impressionism has a number of things going on in it, but I'm going to take you through two of the big things that are happening in Impressionism that are important to understanding Mary Cassatt's work, and then some of these will show up later in the course when we're looking at other American artists influenced by Impressionism. woman artist, right? So she trains in Pennsylvania. She says, these are the limits that I can achieve in the United States. I'm going to the major venue to the arts, which is in Paris. She makes friends with the Manets, Edward Manet. She makes friends with Degas. And she begins exhibiting with the Impressionists. And she is, by the way, the most successful of all the Impressionist artists, if the way you judge her is in terms of the number of works that she exhibited and sold in these exhibitions. She exhibited in more Impressionist exhibitions than any of the others and sold more works. The Impressionist exhibition started in 1874 and went through 1886. They weren't held every year. There were only 8 of them, but they are basically alternatives, and the first consistent alternatives in Paris to the academic exhibitions. So they're an alternative venue for the showing of modern art at this time. 2 of the main kind of components of Impressionism are, number 1, supported by Baudelaire. Impressionist artists will paint scenes of modern life. They will play the role of what Baudelaire called the flaneur. Someone who is a flaneur really means something like an exalted people watcher or an amateur sociologist, someone who's independent in the world and walks around this new modern world and basically makes commentary or represents scenes from the modern world and says, what do you think about this? Paints that and allows the public to imagine how they think about these things. So you're seeing scenes of everyday life and little commentaries on this. After all, the world's changing dramatically with the Industrial Revolution. We've got this burgeoning middle class. Everything in Paris in particular has just been absolutely redone, the Haussmannization of Paris at the time. And these artists are basically painting scenes of that and proffering these to the public to say, well, what do you think about this? The other side of Impressionism is Impressionist artists notoriously are interested in capturing a particular moment in time before, things change, or a particular set of light conditions before things change. What we see every day that we see things is basically the effects of light. And for an Impressionist artist, they wanted to capture the effects of that light at a split second in time before it changed into something else. Now, Mary Cassatt is interested in both of these things, but what I'm going to primarily focus on is, her representations of the role of women in society at this time. What we see here is a work that's called At the Opera from 1879. Now, the venue, the opera, Charles Garnier's famous Paris Opera House, was a place for people to go see, again, the opera itself, a form of high classical entertainment, high art, but it's also a place, and it historically been a place that women go to be seen, that people go to mingle, and women would oftentimes be brought to the opera in order to be put on display so as to gain the attention of particulars men, perhaps getting suitors along the way. Here, for instance, we see a little kind of play on that. The woman that we're looking at is looking through her opera glasses, but she's up high in a loge, an opera box. And instead of looking down at the scene of whatever's going on in the opera, she's basically checking out other people. And while she's checking out other people, follow my cursor, other people are checking out her, right? So it's the way that the artist is making a commentary on what the opera is like, particularly for women. They are there to see and to be seen, to perhaps get a partner. The other side to talk about here is the way that it's painted. Obviously, Cassatt is not trying for hyperfidelity. She's trying to capture these strange light effects in the opera house, and she basically abstracts, and abstract just means to simplify shapes and forms and colors into bold patterns, so that if you get up close on this painting, this is what her face looks like. And this is what the guy looking back to her looks like. Just kind of a squiggle, right? Now, if you associate this with modernism and modernism's interest in drawing attention to the essence of painting, you might put it this way. What is a painting at its essence? What is it before it's anything else, before it's recognized as figures in an opera house, for instance? And the answer would have to be it's paint pigment on a surface, in this case, a canvas. So when an artist wants to be very modern, they're going to draw your attention to the fact that this is a painting, right? It is pigmentation on the cover of the canvas, as well as being figures in space. And we'll see these ideas again develop as we see more and more modern art. But here I want you to be thinking just in terms of modern artists, instead of trying to hide the fact that their painting is a painting or to make you think, wow, that's just a beautiful mountain or a figure, are absolutely trying to draw your attention to the material properties of paint itself to say, here is what I am in the first place, paint on a canvas, and I've got my own aesthetic qualities, as well as being recognizable as a figure. Another, again, opera picture. This is usually referred to as Lydia in a loge wearing a pearl necklace. There is some question as to whether it is Lydia. Lydia was her sister who was dying of an illness at this time and was in Paris convalescing. But whether it's Lydia or not, it doesn't really matter. It's a young woman at the opera sitting in a loge, which is an opera box. And if you're having trouble reading this, what's happening is in the back of a loge, there were oftentimes mirrors that would show you what's in front of her. So all of that up here is the loge. It's the mirror in the loge representing what's in front of her. And I usually like to juxtapose this with this work over here, which is just called The Loge of Women over here, and talk about some of the things that are going on in these two works and flesh out ideas around modernism. Now, usually I would have students do this in their discussion, but in this case, what I want to do is just kind of give you some of the hallmarks. Let's say off to the left, and again, this isn't the only way to interpret this, but let's say off to the left, these young women are acting in the way that is appropriate for a young woman to act when they go to the opera. They're fairly demure, their eyes are very carefully and consciously, looking at probably the scene of what's going on in the opera. They are, not showing any real emotion. They are the one in the foreground is holding flowers in her lap, a symbol of her sexual availability, meaning that she's basically there to gain a suitor. The other one puts a fan in front of her face, which is a good excuse for Cassatt to show a beautiful pattern of paint, but also to show the woman acting demurely. In other words, they're on display, they're acting polite, they're acting in ways that a young, proper woman should be acting, and that's a component of it. The work on the right, however, Lydia in the Loge, she's acting kind of in ways that a woman shouldn't necessarily be acting in society. She's got an open-mouthed smile that in Paris is an incredibly flirtatious thing to do. Because of the tonality that is shown in this work, you can see her shoulders in a little décolletage here as well. She's leaning into us. The way that she's angled actually makes it seem like she's coming closer to the picture plane. And a big quality of this is that the entire work is made up of warm colors. And remember, warm colors feel like they're advancing towards us, that the whole thing's expanding. So it makes her feel even closer to us. Over on the left, by contrast, the figures are all painted in cool colors. Now, there are little dots of warm colors in here, but the color underneath the white here is a blue-purple, and over here, the color under the whites here is a fleshy red, yellow, and so forth. Blues tend to contract, they tend to recede, and the artist here is choosing those color palettes in order to emphasize the message that she's giving, and this is very modern as well. Making determinations about the use of particular colors and their effect on us directly. Warm tends to be, the way we think about Lydia over there. Warm, outgoing, flirtatious, inviting, probably not acting appropriately, frankly, by very strict standards, but nonetheless, the artist has chosen that palette to emphasize. Whereas on the left, demure, proper, cold, meaning demure or reserved, is the color she chooses for the majority of that color palette so as to, again, emphasize the message she wants to get across. And more modern artists will do that. They'll change what we call the local color, the color something would be if we saw it in real life, and substitute in these changes in color and uses of line and uses of space in order to emphasize their message. They start telling their story less through the narrative and the figures than they do through the use of formal elements. And we'll see that over the course of like 40, 50 years go crazy, right? Where pretty soon you don't have figures at all. You just have the arrangement of form in a way that's supposed to impact us in particular ways. The other thing that Mary Cassatt is famous for is reflecting the world that she experienced in her life. Scenes of domesticity, scenes of mothers and children in particular. A lot of the Impressionist artists are painting the world around them. They're using their friends and their family as their models, not to really comment directly on their friends and families' lives. Like most artists, they're using their friends and families as examples of larger things in the world. So in these scenes that you see over and over again, this one's just mother and child from 1890, you're going to see the world that Mary Cassatt, being a woman, has access to and lives in. Women like Mary Cassatt are not going to be showing you scenes like the male Impressionist artists of the streets of Paris, because they can't really wander the streets of Paris without chaperones around. Their flaneurism, their observations are of the world around them, and they give us this glimpse of a world that artists hadn't really paid attention to up till this point. Real scenes, intimate scenes of mothers and children. Now, I always make this joke when I'm teaching the larger surveys that I don't care how great of an artist you have been historically, artists over and again, male artists, can't ever get children right. They're just awkward, horrible representations of children. And here you have a fairly accurate representation of a child because she's around it all the time. The other thing that artists really very rarely get right is that feeling of intimacy between a mother and child. And here, Mary Cassatt, having seen this, having access to it all the time, and being interested in it, represents that. It's a young mother, and if you've ever seen a young mother, right, it's completely appropriate for her to have her mug of coffee here. She loves this beautiful child, but she's tired as heck. She's got it bundled up in her hands, right? This intimacy, this kind of connection, this is new for me in art, and it's because of the emergence of women artists like Mary Cassatt, who are interested in this subject, who have access to the subject, and who have such familiarity with it that they get it right. And over again, you have these types of scenes of mother and children and so forth. Another one. Or scenes like this. You know, Mary Cassatt is going to be witnessing young women all the time. She's going to do quick sketches like this of a young woman or young mother sewing. What are women's roles? What are they supposed to do? Most of the scenes that you'll see of Mary Cassatt or other women artists of the time are going to be interiors, because that's where they are, I wouldn't say confined, but that's their realm. When they depict scenes of women, they're going to show women doing what was still expected of them to do. They're women who are mothers. They're women who are being trained to sew or to knit or to crochet, sometimes cooking, oftentimes taking care of the children, because those are reflective of the roles that they played. When women are reading, more often than not, the books that they are reading are easily identified, as you see here, as basically popular kind of pulp novels. The size of the book in particular will tell you, and its cheap cover, what it is. So these are fantasy books, whereas a man might be opening a very heavy leather covered tome that is, the realm of high literature or philosophy or some kind of area of study. In other words, women are in the realm of fantasy because their world really isn't about needing knowledge or rationality or study in order to do what they are expected to do. Every once in a while you get the indication of a woman reading something other than the realm of fantasy, and in these instances, there's a lot of speculation that Mary Cassatt is actually trying to, being an American and not, let's say, that much bound by the rules of the Parisians, trying to be a little bit revolutionary. This is particularly provocative in her representation of her mother, known as reading Le Figaro. Le Figaro, by the way, is kind of like the New York Times of Paris at this day. It's a very kind of worldly newspaper. This is her mother, a very kind of powerful-looking woman, like one of those grand dames that you might find in a John Singleton Copley picture, reading a newspaper. And if you're thinking, wait a minute, why is this so revolutionary? Well, newspapers were the realm of men. They are the realm of the outside world, of business, of politics, of things that were the sphere of the masculine. And so at this time, and going all the way back to the French Revolution, women had been agitating for the right to vote, the right to own property, the right to divorce their husbands, things that, believe it or not, were illegal from time to time, most of the time in Paris. So when you put in their hands a newspaper, believe it or not, this is a threat to people. If women start actually learning about this realm, maybe they'll, push us men out of our place, or maybe, as you even hear today, unfortunately, if these things change, all society falls apart. I hear that argument all the time around gay marriage. I don't quite get it, but that was the anxiety that was around at the time. And so when Mary Cassatt shows someone reading a newspaper, it's not just a neutral type of representation, I guess is what I'm saying. And then finally, I'll just kind of leave us with this one with Mary Cassatt. The role of women, in this case, woman with child, woman being kind of taken by, this is a work that's called The Boating Party, taken probably to greet her husband. You can see the child kind of squirming to get loose to say hi, and the expectant look on the young mother's face of greeting her partner. But the other thing I wanted to say about this is, look at what's happened here to the representation of form. This is partially accurate, right? Trying to show you what something really looks like, but really what she's done is simplified it down into big, bold patterns of beautiful blues against very vibrant yellows, so that you've got this kind of aesthetic quality of design that is being emphasized at the same level as the narrative that's being supplied to us. We'll end today just by pointing at one other artist, John Singer Sargent, who was an incredibly popular, primarily portrait painter in Paris during the same time period. This is his picture, one of many, by the way, of Isabella Stewart Gardner, the famous heiress to the Gardner family fortune, who started the Gardner Foundation and, of course, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum that still houses her huge collection of work, representing this, again, beautiful young socialite dressed in all of her finery against one of her collected rugs behind her. She's on display, meant to be beautiful, meant to be provocative, and meant to show you something of her material wealth and her culture, right? Her collecting habits. And just because it's such a gloriously beautiful work, Madame X, or Madame Gautier. This was John Singer Sargent's representation of a young, again, socialite, a beautiful Parisian woman, dressed in this beautiful black outfit dress here, that when he exhibited it in the Paris Salon, it was scandalous. And the reason it was scandalous is something that's since been changed. This shoulder strap on this side was off the edge of her shoulder, and it was seen as too provocative. And because this wasn't a female nude, but rather a real woman, that was the scandal, that this woman was supposed to be in high standing and high society, and here she was kind of flaunting her sexual availability, and the artist had conspired with her to do this. So later on he went back and retouched it, meaning he repainted it to put that shoulder strap up above. I just give you that little anecdote, but what I really want to draw attention to is just how gorgeous this is. And it's gorgeous on the one hand because it's a beautiful human being, but the other hand is, look at the tonal contrast. Look at the color he picks for the background and that incredibly ghostly white that he picks for her skin next to the contrast of the black and the different satins and the way they reflect things in the foreground. I mean, it's really a beautiful arrangement of form as well as being a representation of a beautiful woman. And when you get up close on this, he's very sketchy. He's not trying to create a hyper illusionistic painting. He's trying to, again, draw our attention to the material properties of paint. Well, that's an introduction to a much broader set of questions around gender and its representation and women artists and the rise of modernism, but hopefully this is a starting point for things to come. See you next time.